Glendora. I'm so happy to be presenting another program for your Historical Society. I'm really excited to be with you guys again. This is a brand new lecture that I just created at the Select and Surviving Depots of Orange County. A little bit about my background. As Jim introduced, and again, thank you also to the Glendora Historical Society and the Glendora Public Library for hosting this beautiful lecture. I have been researching depots since 1983. It began with falling in love with a railroad depot that was in my hometown of Indio, California, down near Palm Springs. And it has led me into a wonderful career in the field of architecture, for which I worked in the field for 20 years now. And of course, one of my proudest achievements was winning the Leicester B. Holland Prize from the National Park Service and Library of Congress. And quite ironically, it wasn't even for a railroad depot that I won the competition for, which was a nationwide competition. It was for a historic barn that's in neighboring Santa Paula, just a few communities away from me. So without further ado, let's take a look at the heritage railroads of the Orange County, the Southern Pacific, the Santa Fe, the Pacific Electric, and the Union Pacific. We're going to look at the history of these railroads in this community, and then we're also going to look at the rich architectural heritage of each of these railroads and the variety of styles of depots that they built. Orange County, of course, was formed in 1889. It was split off from the southwestern part of Los Angeles County. And it's kind of ironic because at the time when it split off, there was not a lot of orange groves there. It was mostly like things like lima beans and hogs and things like that. And it was being served by two railroads at the time, the Southern Pacific Railroad and the Santa Fe. By the 1920s, the early 1900s into the 1920s, you saw the Pacific Electric enter the picture, and the latecomer to the party was the Union Pacific. This is a kind of a modern map of what Orange County looks like, of course, today. It hasn't changed much. And of all the dozens of depots that were built by these four railroads, only really 9 of them survive today. So it's a very small handful of these survivors. 2 are on the National Register of Historic Places. 1 is an active railroad station. And all the rest have been adaptively rebuilt. Let's take a look at how the railroads infiltrated Orange County. The green lines are for the Southern Pacific Railroad. They came in 1875, and they expanded down into this part of Orange County. They were followed, of course, by the Santa Fe, which is the dark blue lines right there. The Pacific Electric came in around 1903, and those are the red lines that you see. And then the yellow lines up at the top of the map was Union Pacific, which came in at around the 1922, 1923. And then, of course, this is a list of all those different communities and cities in Orange County. And we'll take a dramatic look at how many of those depots survived. Again, just a small handful of them. But as you can see, some of the communities were served by more than one railroad. So you'd sometimes have up to 3 or even possibly 4 depots in a particular community. Here's a brief history of the railroads. Again, the Southern Pacific coming in 1875, the Santa Fe coming in 1887, the Pacific Electric coming in around 1903, and then finally the Union Pacific coming in the 1920s. We've got a lot of depots to cover, so grab a seat on the local and let's start our journey. I've actually organized this lecture by alphabetical order of the cities. So the depots aren't in chronological order. They're in the order of the name of the city. Something to mention about stations versus depots versus passenger waiting shelters and things. So a station is a named place on the railroad. For example, here, this is Almond, California, which was near Anaheim and was served by the Southern Pacific. This is a passenger shelter. So the station was named Almond. So and at a particular station, you could have maybe a passenger shelter, or you could have a depot. A depot is a physical building. A depot would be like the one here in Anaheim. This was Southern Pacific's earliest standard building depot type. It's a combination depot for both passengers and freight. It's a board and batten structure. This was what the Southern Pacific was building throughout California and the West as it was building its railroad empire, not only in Southern California, but Northern California and throughout the West. This is an early picture of the depot after it was renamed to West Anaheim. This was a standard 32-foot wide depot. Here's the back side of the depot. As a depot historian, it's always nice to get these rear views of the depots because they're extremely rare. Most photographers took depots from the track side. And here's the station agent having a little May Day or April Fool's Day fun. He's wearing a rather handsome hat on top of his head there with flowers. So the railroader's job was tough, but it, at least he had a little bit of fun with it. Next, here is the second depot that was built by the Southern Pacific in the community of Anaheim. This was a standard number 22 depot. This was built much later in 1899. And as you can see, it's a lot more refined than the early board and batten style depot. The second story allowed the agent to live in the depot. Having a two-story depot like this allowed the agent to be on site 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And also, the railroad found that having an employee living at the depot was more reliable. They could count on that. Here goes some of the local produce that's being handled through the freight house of the Anaheim depot. Eventually, that depot was superseded by a more modern structure. That was very common for the railroads to do, is that as their depots aged, they would either refurbish them or sometimes just outright replace them. So here's an example in the 1940s where the older two-story depot was replaced by a more modern stucco version. Also in Anaheim, here is the Santa Fe and its beautiful woods depot. It was built in 1888 and it lasted quite a few years. Eventually it was demolished in 1941, but here's a picture of it in 1931. Of all the depot buildings, I always think the Santa Fe had the most unique and beautiful depot. It's very rare to see, standards on the Santa Fe depots. There are some that are similar, but almost all their depots were unique. As with the Southern Pacific, they modernized their depots. And in 1941, they replaced the old wooden Victorian style depot with a beautiful stucco style depot. Here's another close-up view of the details of the depot. And here it is in a few more years later. The agency was closed in 72, and by 1987, this particular depot was removed by the railroad. And unfortunately, it's no longer there, as is the case with many of these stations. Anaheim, here you go. Here's a third depot by a different railroad company. This is the Union Pacific's station in Anaheim. And here it was closed in 1972. It was extensively documented by the Historic American Building Survey. And the reason it was documented so well is that they wanted to reuse the building. And so the city moved the building and then they went over and they used it for, I think, I want to say rehabilitation services for people served by the city. Here's the community of Atwood. This was the second depot built by the Santa Fe in that particular community. I hadn't found a picture of the first depot yet, so I'm always looking for depot pictures. So if you ever have any, please feel free to contact me after the lecture. The next city we're going to look at is Brea. This is its Pacific Electric Depot that was built in 1909 as the railroad line was extended through that area. It didn't last very long. I think passenger service ended by 1938 on this at this depot. And then it was eventually removed. This is the small board and batten station of Buena Park, built by the Southern Pacific Railroad. You can see it's a very small agency indeed. It's a single freight door on the loading dock, and then it's got a very small agent's office and waiting room. Also a board and batten, but it's a very small type of depot. Here it is a little bit later in 1912. This particular depot closed in 1933 and was demolished 10 years later. Now, this is an unusual depot. This is built also by the Southern Pacific in the small community of El Modena. It was a kind of like a Queen Anne style of depot, very unusual. The Southern Pacific did build several of these throughout its lines. There's a sister depot to this in Millbrae, California, which is up in the Bay Area. And then it's kind of a variant of what we call the Chico style of depot, but it's a smaller version of it. And we're actually going to see a Chico style depot built in Santa Ana a little bit later on. Here is the El Toro Santa Fe Depot. This was built in 1888 and then was torn down at least by 1952 after it was closed in 1947. Here's a beautiful, another Santa Fe wooden depot, this one in Fullerton, 1888. Rather large depot, and the freight room, or the freight house is rather large because, again, at that time, Orange County was a mostly agricultural community. Here it is in 1910 with the addition of an interlocking tower. In 1910, they built the Fullerton cutoff and they did like a bypass. So they needed the interlocking tower to control all the switches for that new cutoff. This depot was replaced in 1930 by a more beautiful Spanish style stucco depot. So this is 1930, the new Fullerton Depot. I love that Santa Fe logo up there on the end of the gable there and the station name of Fullerton on there. Here it is a little bit later, they replaced it with a neon sign. This is in the 50s. And then, of course, by the time that Amtrak came through, that was 1971 nationwide. The depot was pretty sad for a little while there. This is in the 1980s. You can see that the continuous use by the railroad had taken its toll on the building. But again, it still had all of its original features. Beautiful Spanish style tiles and wrought iron work. And in the early 2000s, this depot was restored. And you can see that they repainted it. They fixed a lot of the exterior cracks and repainted the building. So these pictures are all from around 2011. That's the street side of the depot. Again, street side pictures are very rare. Mostly you see the track side of these buildings. This is the waiting room inside. What's amazing about this depot is that of all of our depots on this list, this is the only one in Fullerton and all of Orange County that is still actively used as an actual train station. So if you get a chance, you should go and see it in person. It's pretty amazing. And parts of it have been adaptively reused. This was the former baggage room and freight rooms. So you can see how they've adaptively reused it as a convenience store. And here's an exterior view. And this depot is one of those ones that's been listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The Pacific Electric came into Fullerton around 1917 and built this little combination passenger and freight depot. Here it is here, being also used by Greyhound services. Passenger service closed in 1938, But the Pacific Electric used buses up until 1953 to service this particular depot. Here's the back side or track side of the depot with the freight loading dock. And what's nice is that this particular depot, it's listed as a local landmark by the city of Fullerton, and it's preserved today and it's adaptively reused as a restaurant and bar. So these are from a few years ago when it was another restaurant, and now I believe it's called Hopscotch's. What's incredible about these two depots is that it joins a third depot in Fullerton. This one was built by the Union Pacific in 1923. Again, another kind of Spanish style, mission style depot. Here it is a few years later. And here's the depot on the move in 1980. In order to save this particular depot, it was moved about 600 yards to be closer to the Santa Fe station and the Pacific Electric. So if you're in Fullerton and you're looking for a good meal, you can go to this, well, I don't know if you call Spaghetti Factory a good meal, but if you like Italian food, it's okay. But you can go to the Fullerton Union Pacific Depot and have a meal there at the Spaghetti Factory. And literally steps away is the Santa Fe Depot on one side and the Pacific Electric Depot on the other. It's the only place in Orange County where you can actually visit all three types of heritage railroads, all within like 1,000 feet of each other. It's incredible. So it's a really neat place to go rail watching as well. Let's take a look at Garden Grove. This is a Pacific Electric depot that was built in 1908. This was a standard type of depot for the Pacific Electric. The Southern Pacific had a lot of standards, and their parent company, they also owned the Pacific Electric. So the Pacific Electric had a lot of standard style depots that they used over and over again. So here's the depot in 1945, and this one was closed in 1961, and eventually it was torn down again, which is very sad for these beautiful buildings. That depot was superseded by a more kind of like modern style depot in 1926. So here it is in downtown Garden Grove. The one in Huntington Beach was served by the Pacific Electric as it did its march from Long Beach down to the coastline. The Huntington Beach Depot was built in 1904, and you can see some construction activity going on there around this 1907 photo. I love the ladies' Sunday dresses going out down to the beach. I'm sure their white dresses did not stay white for long down in the sand. But you can see an early excursion car coming out to the beach and bringing people out there. Of course, you also see the harbinger of progress in all the automobiles that are coming down to Huntington Beach, which would eventually, of course, supersede the reliance on trolley cars for transportation. In the 1930s, the depot was showing its age. You can see this big metallic arch that they had built over the intersection next to the depot. And by 1941, the Pacific Electric was getting ready to move this particular station and use it a little bit further down the line as a freight depot. So here's the depot being moved by the railroad in 1941. And here it is in 1947 at its new location. The Pacific Electric, which by that time had ceased operations, it was being used by the Southern Pacific, closed this particular building in 1977, and shortly thereafter it was demolished. Next, we're going to look at the community of Irvine, California. This is an open-air passenger shelter that the railroad built there in the on the Irvine Ranch in 1887. And this view of the ranch dates to about 1901. That's the Irvine packing shed there in the background. Later, that depot, they replaced it with a legitimate depot in 1910. So here's that depot, and you can see again the agricultural nature of Orange County at the time. Here's the depot in 1951 during the Korean War. Like many other depots, they were the de-embarkation points for soldiers going off to war, not only in World War I, World War II, and of course the Korean War and others. So these were like focal points for the community and a very important part of the transportation system, especially during wartime. Here's the depot a little bit later in 1964. Sadly, it only has about 5 years left on its service life because a few years after that, it was closed and then eventually it was torn down. This was kind of an interesting little Southern Pacific freight building. It was actually jointly used not only by the Southern Pacific, but by the Pacific Electric as well. It had an extremely short service life, having been built in 1921 and then closed just a few years later. But the depot survived for quite a few years, up until at least 1946. But eventually it was torn down. So you can see the Southern Pacific tracks off to the left, and then the Pacific Electric tracks on the right coming straight at you. The Pacific Electric also built this handsome depot, again, very similar to one of the other ones we had looked at earlier. This is at La Habra, a standard type of depot, type A, built in 1909. I love that open waiting area there in the front with colonnades. And then you had an enclosed waiting room, the agent's office, and then of course a freight room in the back. Here's a look of it a few years later. And then here's the depot in 1965, towards the end of its railroad service life. And by 1971, it had been closed. This is a few years after it had been closed by the railroad. And fortunately, this particular depot survived the fate of many others, and it was saved, preserved, and relocated. And today, it's a community theater. So it's still preserved there in the city of La Habra. So it's in remarkably good shape on the exterior. You get a real feel for how these Pacific Electric depots looked when they were built. Next, we have the Union Pacific coming into La Habra in 1923. They built this beautiful little Spanish-style depot here. And here is the depot a few years after, in the 1940s. And it was saved in place after it was closed. And in 1977, it became the Children's Museum of La Habra. And it's been that ever since. So if you have grandkids or kids and you want someplace to take them, you can take them to this beautiful depot in this that's being adaptively reused as a children's museum. And what's a real special treat, like I said, Fullerton was great because you've got 3 depots all right next to each other. Okay, this is the second best. You've got a Union Pacific depot right next to a Pacific Electric depot. And that was a conscious decision by the city to move the La Habra Pacific Electric Depot next to the existing Union Pacific Depot. So you get when you go there, you get a visit of 2 depots for the price of 1 drive. So it's a nice place to go and see 2 great heritage railroad depots that are preserved and adaptively reused today. We're back to the Southern Pacific. This is the community of Los Alamitos. And it's a 2-story number 22 depot built in 1896. This looks very much like the style that was built in Anaheim. It's a number 22. This particular depot did not last very long. It was closed in 1924. So again, 2-story depot. The upstairs was living quarters for the agent and his family. Next, we come to the little small non-existent community of McPherson. This is in the 1890s. This was a ranch. There's 2 packing houses that were built there. And this is unusual because it's not really a depot, but the packing houses actually provided a corner space and office for the railroad agent for the Southern Pacific. And that's why you see that in the front corner of the building right here. So that was the agent's office. Didn't last very long. It was closed by 1903. Let's continue with the Southern Pacific. Again, this is alphabetical. We come to the community of Newport Beach in 1891. This was originally not the Southern Pacific, however. This particular wharf and the buildings that were built on top of it were built by the Santa Ana and Newport Railroad. They started much earlier. And by 1901, the Southern Pacific had acquired this particular railroad, and they changed the signage on the depot, and it became a very popular tourist destination. There's a later colorized postcard. Of course, that depot was eventually removed, and a newer kind of like modern stucco depot was built in 1927. And this was jointly operated by both the Pacific Electric and the Southern Pacific Railroad. That happened with a lot of these older Pacific Electric depots. They were joint ticket agencies. So you could go there, you could buy Southern Pacific tickets, or you could ship your goods on the Southern Pacific through the Pacific Electric. There's a backside of the, or another view of the depot. Back to the Santa Fe, this is the Olive Depot that was built in 1929. It's a cute little charming, small Spanish-style depot with wrought iron and the Santa Fe logos. Really charming little depot. Closed in 1960, and it was demolished by 1964. The train that's there visiting the depot is a rail fan trip, and they're coming out to see the remnants of the old Santa Fe. Next, we come to the community of Orange. This is a unique little treasure that I dug up at the Southern California Railroad Museum down in Paris, California, from the archives. My thanks to Terry Salmons down at the archives there. This shows the Southern Pacific Depot that was built at Orange, but if you look closely at the bottom of the blueprint, it actually says that this particular depot was moved from San Simon, Arizona, 640 miles away. So that's one of the longest distances that the Southern Pacific had moved one of their depots. And it's great that we have this blueprint because it actually shows where the building was cut into 3 pieces and shipped on the railroad, and then reassembled at Orange, California. Later, this depot was renamed to West Orange. That didn't occur until 1905. But here's a picture of an Arizona depot moved to Southern California. Not uncommon. Sometimes the railroad would move depots from a lesser used station on their line to a more popular station. It's very common. And actually, it's the subject of another lecture that I'm preparing for the future. Because a lot of depots, surprisingly, were moved by the railroads. Of course, we're used to seeing them relocated for preservation purposes, but it's really neat to see them actually moved by the railroads. So here's the back side of this particular depot. In 1912. Next, we go back to the Santa Fe in Orange. This is their handsome wood depot there. And here it is in 1931. Again, I really like the architecture of the Santa Fe depots. They're really pretty. Of course, again, they modernized this particular depot. It was replaced in 1938 by this more modern style station, kind of like a streamlined modern. Here it is in 1956. And then in 1971, this particular depot was closed. All right, show of hands. Is this depot still with us, or is it gone? Who says that it's still here? Who says that it's gone? Wow, almost half of you said that it's gone. Surprise. So, you know, you can save buildings. I mean, you can save these depots, you know. They may look horrible and run down and everything, but there is uses for these buildings. So, you know, we're glad that this building has been adaptively reused, and it's preserved today, used as a restaurant. And it's actually lucky that it's adjacent to an active rail line. So even though it's not used as a depot anymore, it's been preserved and adaptively reused. All right, looking at the Pacific Electric in Orange, California. This is their standard type of depot there. That was the only depot, photo of that early one that I had. It was replaced in 1923 by this more stucco style depot. There's another photo of a nice color photo from 1945. This depot closed in 1963 and sadly was removed in 1986. Here's a look at the Placentia depot, built in 1911, closed in 1970, and demolished in 1971. This was the newer type of Santa Fe depots that were being built by the Santa Fe throughout California. It was a two-story depot, but it could be found in lots of different communities. Here's the small Spanish-style depot of San Clemente, also built by the Santa Fe. This photo is taken in 1940, but it was built in 1931, but closed very early on. I mean, it only had a 9-year service life. And here's another view of the depot showing partially the back side of the building.
Was that San Clemente?
San Clemente, yes.
Back of it?
Yeah, the back side of the station right there. You can see it in the middle of the photograph.
Oh, yeah.
This is the small community of San Juan, not to be confused with San Juan Capistrano, which we'll look at next. But this was a very charming Santa Fe, over the top, Victorian Queen Anne style depot. I'm not sure exactly when this particular depot was removed. Sadly, it's no longer with us. So next we do come down as the Santa Fe is progressing along towards the San Diego area. We reach the town of San Juan Capistrano. Early on, the railroad just called it Capistrano. So here is a look at the beautiful mission-styled depot that was there. Of course, Mission San Juan Capistrano is literally, maybe 1,000 or more yards away from this station. So it's no surprise that the Santa Fe drew inspiration from that surviving mission. Here's another trackside view of the depot. Very handsome depot. Here it is in 1931. And of course, we all know this particular depot is saved. And it's used today as a restaurant, although again, it's not an active train station. So it's a very beautiful depot. If you get the chance, it's really fun to walk around it and see all the brickwork and everything. Even though it's been adaptively reused, there's still a lot of original elements to this building. So it's quite nice to see it restored. Also back up here to Santa Ana. This is the Southern Pacific's depot that was the first depot built in the community in 1877. This was again a standard style depot for the Southern Pacific. It's a two-story. Again, it's slightly different than some of the other ones we've seen, but this is an earlier style. It's like a number, either 1, a 9, or a 10 style. Here's another view of it. This depot did not last very long. It burned in 1896, and it was subsequently replaced with this beautiful Chico style depot. Now, the reason we call this particular style of a depot a Chico style is because the first example of this particular type was built in Chico, California, earlier that same year. So anytime you have multiple copies of a particular depot being built in a community, as a depot historian, we look at that first community and we name the style after that. So if you go up to Northern California and you go to the community of Chico, California, you can actually visit the surviving Chico style depot that's up there. But this is a beautiful Queen Anne style depot. Here it is in 1941, jointly used by both the Pacific Electric and the Southern Pacific. Look at that beautiful detailing in the brick chimney, the shingles, the verge boards, and the gable. The ridge cresting that went across on the top, that's all galvanized metal. I actually have the original blueprints for this particular depot, again, courtesy of the Southern California Railroad Museum. But it's just an absolute beautiful building. And it's nice to see color photos of some of these depots. Southern Pacific standard style of colors was this mustard yellow with the brown trim and then the white windows. So this depot closed in the 1950s, and sadly, it was demolished in 1969. So it's not with us. But if you want to see what it used to look like, drive up to Chico, California, and you can see the surviving one. Here is Santa Fe's Santa Ana Depot. Again, a beautiful Victorian styled station. Built in 1887. This depot lasted until 1939 again because the railroad was modernizing its train stations. And they built a kind of like streamlined, modern depot. This looks very similar to the one in Orange, California. It's very similar in floor plan and styling. Here it is a few years later in 1959. And that's how you travel, ladies and gentlemen. You dress up when you travel. Nowadays, we're so schlumpy. Like, this is how we travel today. This is Amtrak. You wear your shorts and cutoffs and things like that. Sadly, that depot is no longer with us, but at least we have the pictures to remind us of what it used to look like. This is an interesting little depot. This is the one at Stanton. This was built by the Pacific Electric. It was a little freight depot. Okay, we're going to do another quiz again. How many people think this depot is still around? Oh, more people this time. Okay. Where do you think it survives today? You guys may, unless there's a real true rail fan out there, you may not know. It's a very popular destination. You've probably taken your kids there. Close, Knott's Berry Farm. Congratulations, you win a boysenberry pie. So Walter and Cordelia Knott saved this particular depot, which was about 3 miles south of their berry farm, and they relocated it to their berry farm, and it was part of the Calico and Ghost Town Railroad. So here's the Golden Spike ceremony on January 12th, 1952. There's Cordelia, there's Walter. They're all dressed up, and there's a kid doing a photobomb in the background with the locomotive. So if you go to Knott's Berry Farm, this depot is actually still there. So it's a repurposed old Pacific Electric depot. There it is a few years later in the 1960s. And here's what it looks like today. So, and in fact, there's a little plaque inside that talks about the history of it. So isn't that charming? And then it was saved by an amusement park. And of course, one of those things that I'm known for is I draw blueprints of these surviving train stations. So I thought it'd be fun to include my drawing of the blueprint of the Ghost Town and Calico Railroad Depot, which again is a Pacific Electric depot that was at Stanton. All right, going back to the Southern Pacific Railroad and coming up on the end of our journey. Here we are in the community of Tustin. This is a combination station, 2-story, number 18 style depot. This was at the end of the Southern Pacific's line. Originally, the railroad had wanted to build all the way down south to San Diego. There was a problem though. Huntington had a personal grievance against James Irvine, the owner of the Irvine Ranch. And as a result of that conflict, Mr. Irvine prevented the Southern Pacific from building their line through his ranch. And thus that completed the end of the saga for the Southern Pacific Railroad. They never realized their potential of building all the way to San Diego. Of course, they were on better terms with the Santa Fe, and the Santa Fe did eventually build through the Irvine Ranch and then all the way down to San Diego. So that shows you the power of an individual person against a railroad corporation. Here's a view of the backside of the Tustin Depot, showing again the agricultural nature of the area. Those are like, I think those are oranges and other citrus. And what's interesting about this particular depot is that after it closed in 1938, it was sold and moved in the 1940s. And it probably had one of the most bizarre uses afterwards I'd heard of. It was used as a boarding house. And sadly, that boarding house burned in 1944. So this depot is no longer with us. However, if you want to see a surviving number 18 style depot in Southern California, you can go to the nearby community of Whittier, California, and their number 18 depot survives today. And it's also on the National Register of Historic Places. As we come to our alphabetical list is coming to a close. We're now in the city of Westminster. This was another standard Southern Pacific depot. This was number 23 one style depot. Remember I talked about the number 22 two style? This was the one style single story version of that particular depot. In this instance, the agent didn't have to live in the depot. He would just live nearby in maybe like a house or the community. He'd come out when the trains were coming into town and lock the depot, do his business with the trains and the freight and dealing with customers. And then at the end of the day, he would lock up the depot and then go home. So in this instance, the agent did not live in the depot. Here's a rare backside view of this particular depot. Again, backsides of the train stations were not often photographed. So it's nice to see photographs like this. Here's a little lesser known community of Wintersburg. I don't think it exists anymore. But this was a freight house that they built for the ranch there. And I don't think it had an agent's office, but you can see it's kind of like a similar style. Well, it's a variation of a standard Southern Pacific freight house. Our last stop on our tour is at Yorba Linda. This was reached, also ironically, it was the end of the line for the Pacific Electric. It was one of their end of the line stations. They had originally intended to build beyond a lot of these communities in Orange County into Riverside County, but they never did. So at Yorba Linda, this was the end of that particular branch line. And here is the Yorba Linda Depot under construction in 1911. And this particular depot had a short service life. It was closed by 1968. All right, who's in the mood for pie? All right, let's take a look. If you're in the mood for pie, you can go to Polly's Pie in Yorba Linda, in the old Pacific Electric Depot. The depot, okay, it still retains most of its depot-esque-ness, but it's been heavily modified. But again, would you rather have a partially remodeled depot or no depot at all? So that's often a question that a lot of us as historians have to deal with when buildings like this are adaptively reused. I'm grateful that the building still survives today and it still has elements of the depot in it. But if you're driving by down the street, you wouldn't immediately say, hey, that's a Pacific Electric depot. But needless to say, it's a nice place to have a pie. I had one there years ago. And then after that, I went over to the nearby Nixon Library, the Presidential Library, which is just down the street from there. So it's a real neat little place for a restaurant. All right, I can't end this lecture without talking about one of my favorite places to go. I know it's not really technically a heritage railroad, but it did have an association with the Santa Fe. So can anyone tell me what depot this is?
Disneyland.
Yep, this is the Main Street station at Disneyland. Under construction, there it is in 1955. And, you know, of course, designed by Walt Disney based on his recollections of early Santa Fe style depots. The Disney had a relationship with the Santa Fe up until 1974. That's why the depot has like the Santa Fe logo on the railroad. And when you were actually waiting in the queues, they actually had vintage Santa Fe advertisements for their different passenger trains and things like that. And the locomotives were labeled for the Santa Fe, the Disneyland and Santa Fe Railroad. In fact, that's the Disneyland and Santa Fe Railroad logo up there in the top corner. So that brings us on our grand circle tour of Orange County, to borrow a line from Walt Disney. There's a lot of resources out there if you're doing research on a particular depot or you're interested in the history of Orange County and the different railroads. I highly recommend these particular books, especially the Rails to the Orange Groves, volumes 1 and 2. They were produced for the 100th anniversary of Orange County back in 1989. If you're willing to shell out a few bucks for them, you can get them on like Amazon or like through eBay and things like that. Of course, Pacific Electric depots and stations are covered in a wonderful book. There's wonderful books on the general railroad history of Los Angeles by various authors like Signor and Asse. If you're interested in particular depots, Henry Bender's book on the Southern Pacific depots is a great resource. So again, these are resources that I would encourage you to look out for. And then also a wonderful shout out to Rob Richardson, who did a fantastic book on the railroads and depots of Orange County, which served as a nice little backbone for helping me organize this particular lecture. So with that, my lecture comes to a close, and I want to thank again the Glendora Historical Society and the Glendora Public Library for hosting me. And again, this is a second time with your group, and I hope that you will invite me back again for another future program. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.